Marc, the floor is yours.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is Marc Einstein, and I'm the chief analyst at my company, which is ITR Corporation in Japan. And so basically, why I'm here today in Iceland and what I'm going to talk about in about 30 minutes is I'd like to talk to you about Japanese technology. There's a lot of very interesting and exciting things going on, and how that might be relevant to Iceland. So that's what I hope to accomplish in about 30 minutes. So I guess I would just start off by asking, how many people in this room have been to Iceland, been to Japan? I know you've all been to Iceland. Okay, so some people. Okay, great. So basically, Japan, it's a really exciting time because we have Tokyo Olympics coming, we have 5G service launches, we have IoT, exploding. And all these things are creating opportunities, and so I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all about some of these kinds of things. Japan and Iceland, even though Greater Tokyo has 38 million people, so that city alone is 100 times the size of Iceland, there are some similarities. And so I'm going to talk today about some of these things. And so again, I only have about 30 minutes to talk, but what I really want to accomplish today is I want to talk to you about Japan from an Internet of Things perspective. So I'll show you some of the data that my company has generated. We're going to talk about how IoT is being used in Japan. And then I'll show you some technology trends and also some industry use cases, and then I'll make some summary and conclusions. So basically, although clearly there are a lot of differences between Japan and Iceland, I think that there are some areas where there are similarities. And so, basically, if you look at Japan, if you've been to Japan, there are a lot of social issues in Japan, economic issues that I think Iceland is also dealing with. And so, clearly, I think most people know that Japan has a very quickly aging population. And we also have a population decline in Japan, which is very serious. The government doesn't quite know how to deal with it, and they're increasingly looking at technology as a means to deal with this problem. And because the population in Japan is declining, we have a very, very serious labor shortage. In some industries like logistics, delivery drivers for Amazon and things like that, companies can only fill about 30 to 40% of open positions. So we have a very serious labor shortage, which I understand Iceland is also dealing with. We have a big boom in tourism. So when I first moved to Japan about 7 years ago, we only had about 1 million international tourists per year. Last year, we had 16 million tourists. And the goal for 2020 is 40 million tourists. And so, again, from an infrastructure perspective, it's been very difficult for Japan to deal with this, and we're looking at technology. Aquaculture, we're using IoT increasingly for fish farms, for salmon farms, for oyster farms. Clean energy is a focus in Japan. After our nuclear disaster, they want to shift towards solar power, and they want to use IoT to power the infrastructure in Japan. And finally, Japan has its share of natural disasters, from volcanoes to floods, and of course earthquakes. And using technology, as a way to kind of have a safer country is a really huge theme in Japan. So, again, because we have these issues, I think Iceland has these issues, we're really looking at how technology can be used to be a potential solution to some of these problems. But what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about how IoT is being adopted in Japan. And so basically my company is an IT research company based in Tokyo. We do a lot of enterprise surveys. So I did a survey a few months ago, and I'll just share some of the results with you. But basically one of the questions we ask to enterprises in Japan is, how many of you are adopting IoT? And so I did this study in September of 2018, and actually 94% of large enterprises are now running an IoT pilot or running an IoT service, and the vast majority plan to continue. I did the same survey in 2017, only about 40%. So again, IoT is really being mass adopted, and I think those demographic issues like the labor shortage are really driving deployments in Japan. So I think that's interesting, and perhaps there's a similar trend in Iceland. And again, in terms of what industries are really adopting IoT in Japan, what we see is number 1, 2, and 3 are smart logistics, smart factory, and smart transportation. As I mentioned, only about 30 to 40% of logistic driver positions can be opened. So these companies are very interested in self-driving cars, self-driving vehicles, all sorts of these kinds of things. Again, also with the factory, it's getting very, very hard in Japan to hire factory workers. And for that reason, this concept of a factory with no people is something that Japanese manufacturers are really, really excited about. But we are seeing, energy, healthcare, consumer goods, across the board, IoT is really becoming quite popular very quickly. So in terms of, where the spending is in IoT, we ask our customers, in terms of your budget, where is your budget allocated? What we can actually see is that, most of the spending in Japan on the IoT services are really built around applications, is kind of the entry point to IoT. But increasingly, we're seeing a lot of spending in security and platforms. And so what enterprises in Japan are really focusing on now is we understand that with IoT we can connect all our devices, but how do we manage those devices? What kind of platform do we need? AI, things like that, and of course security, which we just heard about in the last speech, is also quite important. So that's just what a typical IoT budget allocation would look like in the Japanese market. So in terms of sensors, because IoT is really just about connected sensors, this is a survey of what kind of sensors our customers are using with their IoT deployments. And you can see here that the most popular ones are position, presence, and proximity sensors, action, movement, speed, and temperature. So this has to do with logistics, connected vehicles, all these kinds of things. But we're seeing all sorts of sensors being used in IoT deployments in Japan. What kind of technologies are being used in IoT deployments in Japan? So the big one, as I mentioned, is platform. Everyone's kind of realizing we can connect all of our devices, but we need this platform to manage it. Most of the IoT, deployments in Japan are running on Wi-Fi, but we do see, a lot of cellular, wired, storage as a service, AI, machine learning are really the popular things that we see right now being used. But in terms of services that are growing, we see a lot of interest in robotics, drones, wearables, these kinds of things. So, what are the challenges in Japan regarding IoT? One, there's a lack of internal skills. There just aren't enough qualified people to run these projects. And, the market solution or the ROI is not quite understood. So I just wanted to throw some data at you to give you a little bit of a taste, hopefully give you the message that IoT in Japan is moving very quickly. But what I'm going to talk about in the next section is I want to talk about some of the unique technologies that Japan is developing. And so basically, one of the really interesting technologies and materials that Japan is quite bullish on is graphene. And if you don't know what graphene is an alloy of carbon, which is a new super material. And so sensors are now being made in Japan using graphene, and graphene is very light and conducts electricity very well, and is very flexible. So we're actually seeing biosensors. So sensors are being printed by companies like Toshiba, and they can actually just be printed on your hand, and they can, for example, in healthcare, talk about how much glucose you have in your blood. They're actually being used on plants. So they're making graphene sensors, and you can put one on a leaf of a plant in a row, and you can actually tell how many nutrients this plant has, how many nutrients that plant has, and you can fertilize and do watering and all these kinds of things at the actual plant level. So graphene is a huge area of interest in Japan, and something that we're going to be talking more about in the future. But where are sensors going? Because IoT is basically about connected sensors, and right now the sensors that we have in our cell phones are mostly about touching, about seeing, and about hearing. And so the next phase for sensor technology might be smell. And so it's actually not crazy to say that in 2 or 3 years, your smartphone is going to be able to smell things. And so this is an example of a Japanese startup called AromaBit. And what they're doing is they have a smell sensor that you can put in your smartphone. And so if you go, for example, in a perfume store, you can wave your smartphone around. It'll make that smell into a digital signal. And then you can use that to scan it online and then find that perfume or find other perfumes. You can use it on coffee. We did a pilot in Narita Airport where they want to use this smell sensor to replace the dogs they have right now that smell meats or drugs or whatever, because those dogs are actually very expensive. They make a mess, they die. And so they want to replace this with just a sensor. And we actually did a pilot. So I think that's a really interesting Japanese technology that you'll be hearing more about in the near future. But I think one of the big things in Japan, with the Tokyo Olympics coming, is 5G. And so 5G is a huge area of focus. I work with the telcos in Japan, and the benchmark, the KPI that they have to hit inside the Olympic stadiums by 2020 is 5 gigabits per second. For all those people. I was in China 2 weeks ago looking at their 5G. We were driving around on a bus in Beijing and getting 3 gigabits per second. The 4G network there only did about 4 megabits per second. So if you want to talk about the future of wireless and all that kind of stuff, it's very interesting, I think, what we're going to see with 5G. But one of the big questions that we have in Japan about 5G is that people are thinking that maybe 5G is going to be the death of the smartphone. And so a lot of companies in Japan are thinking, what is going to come after the smartphone? And so these are some of the things that they're talking about. If you go to the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona later this month, they're actually going to have the first flexible and bendable and rollable 5G devices. That's already been announced. So I think in the next few years, you're actually going to have a tablet you're going to be able to fold up and put in your pocket. So I think that's very interesting from a technology perspective. But looking even further into the future, the kinds of things that are being researched and discussed now are beyond that. And so Samsung has actually patented a contact lens that will be connected to the internet. And what this means is that there's basically no more glasses for seeing. Glasses are just going to be about fashion, because this connected contact lens will adjust to your vision every day. Software update, and so you would actually never need to have glasses ever again. But again, looking even further, Elon Musk has a company where their goal is, in the next 5 years, to implant a SIM card into the human brain. And this is a real commercial company that you can read about, but they want you to basically have an augmented reality brain where you would be able to download Japanese language ability, things like that. So, companies are actually thinking about this stuff. They're talking about it. Facebook is very big into mind-to-text technology, where you actually have a pad on your mind, and you think, it analyzes your brain waves, and it goes to your phone. I think in the next few years, we're going to have the ability to think text messages and send them to their friends and things like that. So I think smartphones will be around for a long time in the 5G era, but in Japan there's a lot of discussion and focus on what comes next, which I think is a really interesting question. So I mentioned tourism is something Japan is really struggling with. Everyone I've met in Iceland speaks English really well. This is not true in Japan. And so language is a huge issue. And so 5G has been looked at as a way to potentially deal with this. So actually, if you go to areas like Ginza now in Tokyo, you're going to hear more Chinese than Japanese. There's been a massive influx of Chinese tourists. 80% of them buy cosmetics, which has actually kind of saved the Japanese cosmetics makers like Shiseido. And so what is going on now is Shiseido is actually using hearable devices that translate Chinese and Japanese, because they just can't hire enough people to work in their store to deal with tourists and things like that. But Shiseido, in terms of actual 5G technology, we did a pilot with them where 5G is going to be really fast, but it's also going to have a very low latency of maybe 1 or 2 milliseconds compared to maybe 100 milliseconds today. They actually did a pilot where they're using a robotic glove, and they can have one of their best makeup artists in Tokyo use this glove, log into this 5G glove, and they can actually apply makeup for a runway model in Paris or Milan or New York City. So even a company like a cosmetics maker is looking at 5G as a way to deal with tourists. They're looking at 5G as a way to innovate and have their services be global. And so I thought that was a quite interesting use of a 5G network. Another thing that's really interesting in Japan is Japan has a new satellite network called QZSS, which is launching as we speak. Right now, the GPS in Tokyo, there's a lot of really tall buildings in Tokyo. The GPS accuracy can be about 30 or 40 meters. Because of the new satellite system, we're actually going to have accuracy of our GPS get down to 2 centimeters. And if you think about it, if you use services like Uber, often the driver doesn't really show up. Maybe he's across the street and things like that. But because of these kinds of new satellites, we're going to be able to have 2 centimeter accuracy on a smartphone in the next few years. And Pokemon Go, I don't know if that was big in Iceland. We still have 5 million daily players in Japan. Most of them are men over 50, actually. So if you go to Tokyo, sometimes you see just a group of people, old guys, kind of randomly standing there. They're still playing Pokemon Go, believe it or not. But if you think about what you could actually do with a 2 centimeter accuracy on a game like that, is just absolutely amazing. So I think this super accurate location-based services is also something really interesting that we're expecting. So I'll talk about the IO industry kind of use cases in Japan. One of the things I wanted to talk about was, again, Japan kind of sees IoT as a way to improve society, not just to make money, although that is important. And so I'll tell you very quickly about another project we did on a little island called Yonaguni. Yonaguni is the southernmost island in Japan. So you can see on this map, it's actually just off the coast of Taiwan. It's a very small island with 1,400 people. And what the Japanese government decided to do was they decided to make this the first IoT island in Japan. And so the mobile operator NTT Docomo is actually connecting everything on the island with an IoT network. Because it's a small island, we can do it with just 1 or 2 base stations. And so all of the cars, all of the homes, all of the offices, all of well, there's 1 school, there's 1 hospital, all these things are being connected to IoT with the goal of making the island a more competitive place, a safer place. And so I got to go down there. It's an interesting island. There's only 1 road that goes on the island. And for example, there's actually only 1 taxi on the island. So they have this huge problem that when a plane of tourists come, they all have to wait for this 1 taxi. And so what they're doing now is they're actually using a self-driving bus. So now they have the 1 guy, and they also have the bus, which is semi-autonomous. So that's one example on how they're kind of using IoT to deal with this. And I was really surprised when I got there, the island actually only has 1 traffic light. And I said, when I got there, I said, why do you need any traffic lights? And I was quite shocked by the answer. They said, for children, because the children need to know what a traffic light is when they go to the mainland. So they actually built 1 there just so kids would know what that is. But we're actually connecting the entire island to IoT. So some of the services that we're using, and this is how it's set up. It's a public-private partnership. So what we're doing is we're working with several of the local government offices. We're working with their agriculture cooperative, and the telecom operator is NTT Docomo, who's the largest mobile operator in Japan. And so what we're doing is, for example, a lot of people there have cows. So a lot of the really expensive Wagyu cows they raise in their backyard for side income. And then they're sent to kind of the Osaka, Kobe area to grow up. And so all of these cows are now connected to the internet. And so people get text messages on if they're ready to give birth, if they've given birth, if they're sick. So all this kind of stuff has gone digital, is automated. We're also making services where, for older people, if somebody falls down, if somebody is, going to the bathroom, if someone is sleeping, all these kinds of things can be kind of monitored if people have relatives that live in Tokyo or Osaka or something like that. That's another service that we're doing, but we're actually looking at very, more advanced services. So I mentioned I went to China a few weeks ago, and one of the reasons I was there was they actually did the first live surgery on a living animal using a 5G network. And so what they actually did was, again, they're using a 5G robotic arm. They had a doctor in one building, and then 50 kilometers away, they had the animal hospital, and they actually did a live operation on a pig using a 5G network. And I was there, I watched it. They cut open the liver, they removed a tumor, and they sewed up the pig using a 5G network. The reason I was there is that they're looking at telemedicine for this island, because right now, if someone from this island needs to go see a specialist, they need to travel, about 6 to 8 hours, depending on where they need to go. And so we're looking at 5G as potentially a way to make this much easier for the local residents. And so that's another example of a technological service that we're using in Japan for kind of smart cities. Autonomous driving, because of the importance of the automotive industry in Japan, that's a huge area of focus. So I can tell you that in Tokyo, in downtown Tokyo, we actually have the first commercial autonomous driving service in the world. So if you know Tokyo at all, if you go from kind of Tokyo Station area to Roppongi, we actually have one taxi that's running 4 routes a day. For about 1,500 yen, which is about 1,500 krona. It has a driver, but it's autonomous. And so there's a huge interest in self-driving vehicles, not only in the urban areas, but actually maybe especially in the rural areas. We have a huge problem because Japan is getting older that elderly people cause a disproportionate amount of traffic accidents, but if they have to surrender their license, they have no mobility. And so actually Uber tried to launch in Tokyo and didn't do very well, and so they've actually they've kind of pivoted to provide services for older people in especially rural areas because there's an issue with mobility. And so companies like SoftBank and NTT are working a lot with commercially driving vehicles. So because Japan is going to have the Rugby World Cup in this year, and we're going to have the 2020 Olympics, there's also a lot of talk about sports technology. And one of the interesting areas for sports tech is this service, which is actually developed for baseball. Baseball is really the national sport in Japan. And so one of the teams, the Yokohama Bay Stars, actually have a virtual reality service that they use for training for the hitters. And so I've actually tried the service, and it's pretty interesting. But what I found especially interesting about this service, because I've talked to the company that's developing it, is what they're doing now is they have the virtual reality service, and they're actually adding AI and machine learning to the service where it's now very customized. So the Yokohama Bay Stars is one of the teams, and they use this for practice, but the next generation of this service is they're actually going to be able to change the pitcher based on real data from the real pitcher. So if they're facing a particular pitcher the next day or the next week, they can actually program to face that specific team. So AI, machine learning, all these kinds of things are getting very, very customized. So sports tech is another area that is quite hot in Japan. And retail overall is a huge issue, again, because of the labor shortages in Japan. They're just not able to hire enough people, so they're increasingly looking at technology. So for example, maybe Uniqlo, I don't know if people here know that, but that's the really big fast fashion company in Japan. They're actually putting RFID on everything in all their stores, so they actually know in real time how many brown sweaters and how many green sweaters and how many blue sweaters they have in inventory, where they are. what's selling, what's not selling, and they're making decisions in real time. And that's just using RFID. Using artificial intelligence and augmented reality for makeup and cosmetics and giving people recommendations is something we're seeing in more and more retail stores. And then I think the next generation is actually using virtual reality for purchasing. And so again, I talked about Yonaguni Island. Another one of the services that we're working on with one of the big department stores is they're trying to make a virtual reality store where somebody can actually go and walk around the store as if it was a real store, but they can actually touch things and then they can buy it, and it will be automatically shipped to their house. Because again, if you live on Yonaguni Island and you need to travel 8 hours to go to Tokyo to buy a new washing machine or refrigerator, they want all of that to just be in virtual reality. So I think that in Japan, there's also a big push for IoT use in retail. So I think just some other things that are really big is automation. So using AI, labor shortage is a huge issue. This is an example of a Japanese startup called Gauss. What they do is they've actually designed an AI algorithm system for tagging of products. A few years ago, if you had an e-commerce product you wanted to put on Amazon or something like that, you'd actually have to have a person sit there and list the features, the color, the size, the material, all this kind of stuff. But basically in Japan, all this kind of stuff is just automatically scanned and automatically tagged. So the kind of idea of e-commerce and having image recognition technology that has almost completely gone digital in Japan. And so there's a lot of other industries that are also looking to go digital as well. So another one I wanted to talk to you about, this is an example, a big problem that we have in Japan, again with the elderly population, is that there's a lot of scams. So like older people will often get a call in the middle of the night saying, oh, it's your grandson's best friend, he was just in a car accident, please send $10,000 to me right now because he needs emergency surgery. This is a multi-billion-dollar problem in Japan every year. And to kind of deal with this problem, Fujitsu actually came up with an AI service where if you have relatives, if your parents or your grandparents might be vulnerable to this kind of thing, you can sign them up for this service. And these calls are basically run by people in call centers reading a script. And so that script is very similar, and that script can actually be detected by voice recognition technology. And so if you sign up your parents for this kind of service, if they get this kind of call saying, oh, help me, your grandson or your son has a problem, send money, these kinds of things will be picked up, and you will get a notification saying, hey, your mother or your grandmother, might have had this just happen, please call her, please check on her. And so voice recognition technology is a really big focus, AI, and again, providing some sort of social benefit service is something we're also really looking at in Japan. Again, robots. So I think most people know that Japan has always been really big on robots, but we're actually starting to see more and more robots in everyday life in Japan. And so some examples, this is a robot that's made by Fujitsu. It's for retail. It actually moves around in a store and it scans the inventory in real time. So you can know, how much inventory you have. Loss prevention, so people stealing things. This is another robot where it actually can move around in the ceiling, and it can tell, it has image recognition to tell if someone has put something in their wallet or their bag or something like that. And then moving to the, one more minute, okay, moving to the fully autonomous store, the store with no people. We're actually going to have the first one coming later this year. We're going to have a 7-Eleven in Japan that's not going to have any humans working in it. So that will be, I think, pretty interesting. So actually that was my presentation. It was only about 30 minutes, but I hope that I gave you a little bit of a taste of what is going on in Japan from a technology perspective. I hope you all get the chance to visit Japan one day. The krona and the yen are about equal, so it's been very easy for me to do math. Japan and Iceland are also both extremely expensive, so you won't be shocked when you get there. But there's no time for questions in the main session, but I'm going to be around today. And if you have any questions for me, I'd be really happy to talk to you later. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc.